Good morning, Vineyard Church Glendora. My name is John Ragsdale, and I am really thrilled to talk with you a little bit this morning about Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 through 7. So let's just begin. Let's just jump in with some introductory comments and review. What do we know about the book of Philippians? Well, one thing that we know is that it's written by St. Paul while he was in house arrest, probably in Rome, although some advocate for different places, but I think probably Rome. And, so he could have some visitors, but it was very much like a lockdown situation that we have. So it's a perfect book for us to be looking at in this particular time. So it is one of the so-called prison epistles because of that. We also know that the idea of joy or rejoicing is a dominant theme in the book of Philippians. In fact, it's mentioned 16 times in the book. I think it's 7 times as a noun, joy, and 9 times as a verb, rejoice. And it's so crucial to the book of Philippians that some have even said that maybe we should call it the Epistle of Joy. And that makes a lot of sense for me, especially since I've been thinking a lot about joy over the last few months. And some of you know that. You've listened to a couple of the recordings that I've done. And so I want to start, first of all, and say thank you to my wife, Sue, for enduring some of what I call my joy rants. I read something, I come to some kind of new illumination about the subject, and she has to hear me talk about it. She's probably pretty thankful that I can talk to somebody else about it this morning. So I want to thank Sue for enduring those I think appropriately named joy rants. I also want to thank Abigail and Jacob for allowing me to think out loud with you, to engage you as thought partners in this idea about joy, and indeed for this opportunity to bring some of those things together. Now, for me, this focus on joy over the last few months is kind of interesting in that for the previous 2 years, I had been doing a lot more work on lament, and specifically lament as it's related to racism. Abigail and I are both a part of a grant team at APU. There have been a total of 4 pastors, senior pastors. Abigail is one of the 4, and 4 professors brought together. We got a little grant to study this, and some of you have been involved in that project, and I want to thank you for your involvement and investment in that project. So now, over the last few months, I've been thinking about joy. I see it as a natural consequence of thinking about lament because of the hopefulness and the faith and trust in God that you find in very many of the lament psalms. In fact, most of the lament psalms. But there is that idea that we see in Psalm 137, right? How can I sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? That is, in effect, the way in which lament and joy comes together. I know I should, but I don't find it within my capabilities at this moment to rejoice because of how difficult life is at this moment. So that got me thinking about categories or types of joy. And here are some things I think that I've come to conclude about joy. So let's start first with the kind of comparison that's often made that joy and optimism go together. I want to say, for me, I don't think they do. I think optimism demands that there be a sunny side of life or an anticipation of things getting better. I don't think joy is dependent on that at all. I also think that there are various kinds of joy. And in terms of broad categories, I think there's a joy that comes from without that is dependent on circumstance. And then I think there's a joy that emanates from within that is a response of the will. So what do I mean by this circumstance-dependent kind of joy? Well, I think it's joy that depends first on things going well. Things are okay with me. Things are okay with my kids. Things are okay with my friends. Life's not perfect, but it's okay. Everybody's relatively happy and healthy. And that can be interrupted, of course, at any moment with the next phone call. But it's that kind of dependence on circumstance. There's also a kind of euphoric joy, isn't there? There's the joy of maybe a wedding or the birth of a new child or new grandchild, right? Or a graduation. Maybe your team wins the World Series. Sorry to all you Dodger fans. This is something that you're probably not very familiar with, but we St. Louis Cardinal fans are pretty familiar with what it means for our team to win the World Series. And so, but that kind of euphoric joy, hope that joke didn't fall too flat, that kind of euphoric joy lasts but a moment, right? There's the high, it's very manic. There's the high of the moment, and then life goes back to normal pretty quickly. But then there's this other category, this other kind of joy that I call circumstance-independent joy. It is the joy, perhaps, of the will. It is decisive joy. It may be in the response to encouragement. It may be a simple act of the will. I'm done thinking about life this way. I remember when I was in my early to mid-30s, and I was driving on Compton Avenue over close to my parents' house. In fact, I think I was picking my mom up for a prayer meeting early that morning. And it's just like I had this awareness, like the Lord had just kind of shown me something about my life. And that was that I was heading toward being a very cranky and crabby individual. And I just didn't want it. And I asked the Lord to help me to get beyond that. And it's a fight I still fight, much more successfully now than I did when I was in my 30s. I'm not really sure how Sue made it in some of those years. But it is that kind of decisive, I don't want to be this. It's an act of repentance, perhaps, to say, I am abandoning that in favor of this. There's also a kind of joy that I call a joy that in spite of. A joy in spite of circumstance. The circumstances are definitely not the kind that we would relate to joy. I think of, lockdown, right? I think of job loss. I think of death or sickness of loved ones. I think of imprisonment that St. Paul was going through. There are all kinds of really terrible things that happen in our lives. Life is not for the faint of heart, that's for sure, right? If we've lived longer than about 2 or 3 minutes, we're figuring that out, and we continue to figure it out throughout our lives. That we must be somewhat resilient if we're going to make it through life. Yet we find a way of rejoicing anyway. We find that commitment. I will rejoice anyway, no matter what the circumstance looks like. And so I think of that as a kind of joy in spite of.